Just to introduce Dr. Angie and Dr. Talal and myself. So my name is Dr. Ibrahim Al-Mazidi. I'm a resident psychiatrist. I'm a student of Dr. Talal AlAli in the psychotherapy program. And
I'm Abdullah Al-Khalifa, and I'm a counselor at a private university in Kuwait.
So
nice to meet you.
This is part of an educational podcast that we're doing. And we're really honored to have two of you on board. First, to hear Dr. Angie's study, which we went through, me and Abdullah, we went through it thoroughly. And we were very surprised to see the depth in which you were discussing many things in the Muslim world. And personally, I thought Dr. Talal would be the right really person to maybe present another opinion or present sort of a take on this issue. So Abdullah, you have anything to add on that?
No, it's just a very, very important topic really to have because the people see a lot of clash between the religion and actually what psychotherapy is, and the people tend to use it against each other or actually use it together, just to implement with each other. But this article, I feel like it sheds light on this topic and how important it is. And I'm really excited to talk about this now.
Brilliant. Same here.
So we're gonna divide the talk into maybe just beginning talking about some of the points we noticed in your study, and then maybe we can hear Dr. Talal's take on it afterwards. So feel free to stop us whenever you like.
Again, before they start, Ibrahim, I would like to give me the permission to be able to record.
Inshallah. Okay. I don't know how to do that. Maybe I can make you a co-host.
Make me a co-host, yes. Make me a co-host. That would work.
Can you record now, Dr. Talal?
Yes, now yes.
Oh.
Beautiful. Okay.
Great. So to begin with, I'd like to talk a little bit about your introduction, Dr. Angie. If you could, in the beginning, you mentioned in your study globalization, you mentioned colonialism, you mentioned the recent pandemic and how there's a very complex interplay between this and the way Muslims view mental health. We'd like to hear your thoughts on that point that you started off with in your study.
Yes. I mean, I guess the takeaway from the paper is that psychology and psychotherapy has always been Western dominated. And even though there are a number of kind of very ancient and very, very relevant explanatory models, indigenous explanatory models, these have been over the years completely disregarded because the understanding is that what tends to come from the West is the best. And so very often people in non-Western cultures tend to look at the West as a way to contribute to knowledge, as a way to kind of move forward. And that has created an environment in which there is a trend towards hegemonic globalization in terms of cultural messages, in terms of healthcare system. And psychology has always been Western dominated. So from the inception of psychology, it has been a hegemonic science because it has very much moved away from religion. So if we go back 100 years ago, even in the West, it was very unlikely for people to go to a secular figure. People would go to the church, they would go to neighbors, they would go to the community. Whereas with the introduction of social sciences, we've actually completely lost that. And psychology has moved away, and it has created a domain which had to be completely separate from religion in order to develop its own identity. And with that, psychology has lost a lot. It has lost the capacity to view individuals in a kind of holistic way. It has very much taken on board this dualistic idea that the mind and the body are separate. Whereas we very often know that if we are not kind of mentally or emotionally feeling great, then we are tired. We know that if people are in pain, physical pain, that also impacts on the mood. And so the division between the mind and the body, which is characteristic of the West, is something that is not always relevant, particularly to non-Western cultures. Nevertheless, because of the dynamics in the world, kind of what are I guess the remains of colonialistic mentality is that everything that comes from the West has to be implemented because it's better, it's more advanced, and so on. In the last, I would say, kind of decade, particularly in the last few years, there's been a lot of awareness of these dynamics. There have been people who have been incredibly vocal about the dangers of a homogenic globalization, which is much more subtle nowadays. And so people kind of struggle more to recognize it. So if in the 19th century, countries would physically go invade other country and try and replace governments or take over, nowadays that kind of colonialism is happening on a much more subtle in a much more subtle way, and we see it happening through the education system. So a lot of schools, universities in the Middle East that tend to have English as the first language. We know, for example, that a lot of young people speak English as the first language because they are kind of very often raised by nannies who come from abroad. And so Arabic becomes their almost their second language, something that they have to learn. And you can imagine that, if we wipe out, a language, that comes a whole set of cultural messages and cultural traditions as well. And the other way in which colonialism is now being implemented is via the medical system. So once again, everything that comes from the West, tends to be more advanced. We know that there are health holiday clinics in the West where people from non-Western cultures actually travel specifically for health-related reasons. And that can have a serious impact on the cultural traditions and the cultural identity of a nation or communities in general.
Yeah, and if I may add to a point that you mentioned where the Western, the psychotherapy, the practices they use, it's the best. It also feels like it's the only option that there is, especially when it comes to literature, for example. Like it's really overwhelming, the amount of literature that comes from the West that can easily overtake whichever local sort of publications or literature that exist.
Absolutely. This is something that earlier on we spoke about, kind of non-politically kind of discourses. And I think something needs to be mentioned here. The majority of journals come from the West, because that's where the resources are held. And so there is a tendency to kind of publish more articles that are related to the West. And also, I think it's also important to mention that there is a move in academia, and particularly in publishing, towards what is called open access journals. And so lecturers or academics actually now have to pay. In the past, the journals were available through subscription. Nowadays, lecturers or institutions pay a fee. Now you can imagine, and these fees are considerable, you know, they can vary between £2,000 to £3,000. Now you can imagine that institutions in the West or in high income countries, they have more funding available compared to institutions in non-funding kind of countries. And that again has an impact on, you know, what gets published, who is available to reach out these journals, because you can imagine that the high impact journals have fees that are, you know, much higher than lower impact journals. But that has an impact on the visibility of the papers. So absolutely, there are a lot of really, really complex dynamics that unfortunately are not spoken about enough, but that they need to be discussed if we want to shake the system a little bit.
If I can add something, you know, I found it really interesting. You mentioned a lot of the founders of several schools of psychotherapy, and you started with Freud and you went on with different schools of thought, and you pointed out how they didn't really make room for spirituality, and they tried to distance themselves from this or even view it in a very critical manner. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, absolutely. I guess it stems from what we spoke about earlier on, and the fact that when psychology was born and it had to create his own identity, it created an identity that was very much in antithesis to what was religion, and what were the common practices of the people, which were to rely on friends and family and the community and, you know, known traditional kind of practices. I mean, I remember my great grandmothers, you know, saying, if you have a bad dream, if you constantly have a bad dream, you need to turn the pillow, you know. So things like this obviously are not scientific. But nevertheless, they might still kind of produce a placebo effect. We don't know. But psychology was very, very keen to create an identity which was based on science, you know, in order to kind of, I guess, justify its, you know, being a legitimate science. And so the early psychologists, the early psychotherapists very much moved away from that. And shoved religion and spirituality to the domain of priests and the domain of the church in the West. And that's how very much, you know, how psychology developed. The issue with that is that it can alienate people who, and I'm not, you know, in this particular moment, we're not only talking about Muslims, but I know, for example, a lot of Christians who might not necessarily identify with some of the very secular teachings of psychology, because ultimately there is no space for their beliefs. And so that becomes an issue when psychology was initially founded to serve the people. But what we are doing now is that we are only serving a fraction, a segment of a population, whereas we are completely neglecting the needs and the belief systems of other people. Or even worse, we expect them to start buying into our belief system. And that's what happens with colonialism, that we develop one way of thinking, which we then export to other people, other countries, and so on.
I even have a personal experience of what you're talking about, which is my second master's degree. It's an international counseling degree from a university in the US. It's called international counseling because to them it's international, but the whole master's I did was in Kuwait and was about Kuwait, and was while I was physically here in the country doing my research and practicing and gaining my experience. So everything I learned was about my own culture and my own population, but still the degree at the end is international counseling, because as you said, the resources are from there, you know. And so it's funny because when people ask me here, it's like, so what's your master's in? And it's like, my second master's in counseling if I just skip the international if I'm speaking to people from here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main issue is that even now, for example, when we teach, so at university, we only teach Western-based approaches because we teach person-centered, we teach psychoanalysis or psychodynamic, we teach CBT, we might kind of stretch to systemic therapy, you know, but they're all Western-based approaches. And so what is really important is that we start decolonizing the curricula. This is something that at our university, we are incredibly committed to doing. So as part of the, you know, I've been there for a year, but in the past year, there have been incredibly kind of exciting, you know, changes where we introduce things like Islamically modified interventions, African psychology, and that gives a sense that actually is not all about Freud and Rogers and so on, but there are other indigenous approaches to understanding human beings and understanding the stress. And that's where what we need to do is not just about, and I don't want to move ahead, but it's not just about modifying the interventions and giving it a more kind of culturally sensitive flavor, but it's about developing and really embracing culturally diverse ways of thinking, which might not necessarily kind of be the way that we've been taught so far. If that kind of, but it's interesting because very often, you know, I kind of run interview kind of potential students, and I often ask, how do you feel about being taught only Western-based approaches? And the majority of the time, people look at me as if I'm some sort of an alien, you know. So like, what do you mean? You know, we learn this and this and that, and I'm like, yes, but they all come from the West, you know, and they're all very often, you know, models that have been kind of created by men, white, middle to upper class men, and so they are models that are very much encapsulate a specific cultural context that might not apply, and very often doesn't apply to other contexts. And so we need to kind of step back, and we need to kind of, I guess, re-win the minds and the hearts of people in a different way, not expecting them to just kind of take on what, you know, mainstream models have been.
Dr. Angie, you added in your study some interesting statistics I'd like to share. So you mentioned that in some studies, only 11% of American Muslims would seek therapy, and 19% would approach religious leaders. You also mentioned that a big proportion of people in the Arab region, specifically in the GCC, would actually visit traditional healers before seeing therapists. So their figure was around 60% of Omanis, 58% of Iraqis, 42% of Saudis, and half of Emiratis. And you added that many people, even after seeing a mental health counselor or a therapist, they would continue seeing the traditional healers. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. And this is incredibly important because I think that's where the future of psychology should be in not just in the Middle East, you know, I think worldwide, you know, by reintegrating this divide. It's not just about choosing psychology or choosing, you know, a sheikh or a priest or whatever, choosing spirituality and religion, but actually, you know, the two things can work together. And so services should very much, I'm talking about kind of psychological services, should very much work with mosques, for example, because that's where people tend to go, or with community centers. Human beings are incredibly resourceful. And very often, before going to a psychologist, they have tried millions of things. People have tried to resolve problems by themselves, and then they have, maybe they have spoken to the best friends, and then the family, and then the community, and then the religion. So we tend to be the last people, the last, the last people who intervene in, situations. And that can at times deteriorate symptoms, because the duration of untreated illness can increase. But if we started incorporating ourselves as part of communities, first of all, stigma might kind of be reduced, because people will not see us as this kind of alien service that hasn't got anything to do with the community. But also we would be able to reach out people much earlier. And I think the issue with not necessarily wanting to approach mental health services has to do with what is the explanatory model for mental illness. There are huge differences in how Western cultures and non-Western cultures kind of view the etiology of mental illness. And so in the West, there is very much this idea of a biopsychosocial approach. So we develop psychological difficulties because there is a genetic predisposition which stays dormant, and then it gets triggered by something in the environment. And then there might be a lack of support, which has an impact on how we think and how we feel and so on. Whereas in non-Western cultures, it tends to be a much more holistic way of viewing situations and difficulties that often has to do with the supernatural as well. And so a lot of people might believe that mental health or, mental illness might be the result of a jinn, for example, or sorcery. It might be a test from God. And you can imagine that if you believe that you are tested by God, or if you believe that you are experiencing symptoms because of a jinn, you're not likely to go to a doctor. You're likely to go to your local community and, the mosque or, what have you. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that, and we move away from believing that these are not suitable explanations, because if we do that, then we kind of, again, reinforce this colonialistic mentality that what comes from the West is much better than what comes from kind of indigenous cultures. I think it's important that we embrace these models out of kind of respect for the community, but also, because they're important explanatory models that can actually set the path for interventions. And we know that interventions that are culturally sensitive or culturally relevant are much more effective than interventions that, people don't recognize themselves with. And so it's incredibly important, to continue to work with these explanatory models, because, and to continue to work with the community and religious services, so we can actually do what we are supposed to do, which is serve the community, rather than expect the community to buy into an idea of mental health services or psychological distress that is not relevant to them.
I can add something. I found it really fascinating. You tried to draw some similarities between Al-Ghazali and his concept of mental well-being, and you tried to draw a correlation between that and the CBT model, and trying to contrast them as well. Would you like to tell us a little bit about this exploration?
Yes, I mean, I think that is fascinating, because when I first set out to kind of research Islamic scholars, I had no idea what I was going to find, because I'm a kind of Western baby in a way, and I have been indoctrinated into thinking that that psychological models were born in the 50s or the 60s, you know, or what have you. And I was completely amazed to actually see that what we now call a CBT, what we now call a CBT conceptualization of the psyche, has kind of always existed. I mean, we're talking about scholars that lived in the 9th, 8th, 11th century. And they very much kind of spoke about gentle talking to manage mood. They speak about kind of changing the way in which we think. They speak about the importance of thinking and how that is correlated with the heart. And I guess this is really an example of what the West has done, which is kind of taking models that have always been present, repackaging it nicely, giving it a fancy name, CBT, and then kind of saying, yes, we've created the solution to all our problems. And that's kind of, in essence is what colonialism is in, 2022. Whereas, going back and seeing that actually these ideas, were present, really made me wonder as to why we're not going back to the original models, because they are much more culturally relevant. So the Ghazali model, for example, incorporates the idea of ruh, the soul, which is not present in the Western models. But we know that kind of a lot of non-Western cultures, I'm not just talking about the culture, the kind of Islamic culture, but even other Eastern cultures, they don't separate the spiritual element from the person. And so it's incredibly important to kind of be able to incorporate those models, because they might actually speak better to the person. What I think is kind of really interesting in that model, and I know we don't have the two diagrams, so it might be a bit difficult now for people to kind of relate to what I'm talking about if we don't have the two diagrams. But, they're very similar in the sense that they both have the aql and the logical, the thought as something that, in a way, can bring about psychological distress. Then we have the emotions, and we have the qalb for the qalb for the CBT, the Ghazali model. And then we've got in the behavioral element for CBT, and we've got nafs for the kind of Ghazali's model. But the important thing, regardless of what the different parts are, is the interconnectedness of these four elements. Because an imbalance in one can actually contribute to imbalances in the other elements of the cycle. And that is something that, CBT also speaks about. So it's incredibly kind of important to, one, kind of compare these two models, but also really think about which model is able to speak better to people. And if we have an indigenous model that very much says what the non-indigenous model says, why not going back to the source and using that? I think this is incredibly important, because I think in this particular case, Islam or Islamic models don't have anything to envy to Western models. In fact, they were there before. I think also if we think about it, I mean, the pillar of CBT is the idea that men are not moved by things as such, but they are moved by the thoughts that they form about things. And that was kind of taken from the Greek philosophers. But actually what we know is that kind of Muslim scholars had actually stated that. And so we've got Al-Kindi, who had stated, and we're talking about kind of, again, probably 9th or 11th century, Al-Kindi stated, sorrow is not within us, but is brought upon us by ourselves. So again, we see the exact same principle. It's not that we exist and we are unhappy, but it's just how we approach things, how we experience things. And so it's incredibly, and I know that I keep reiterating this point, but I think this should really be the takeaway point, is that we have models that have a very fancy name, and they've been repackaged and, kind of sold as the golden standard. But actually, we have indigenous models that are very much kind of said the exact same thing. And so it's really important that we go back to them.
All right.
Sorry, I could go on forever. At some point, you need to stop
That's
me.
wonderful. Dr. Talal, we'd like to hear your comments, your thoughts, and maybe we can turn this into a fruitful discussion. The mic is yours, Dr. Talal.
Great. I was really enjoying the talk. I really enjoyed it, but I'm not sure I disagree. I agree with it. I do disagree with a lot of points, which is fine. There are certain notions I would like them to be clarified, and I would like to speak about them from my point of view, and then I would like to hear what's your take on that. First of all, the idea of the West and colonization. Many European people, when they speak about colonization, they think of what happened in the 16th or 18th century. But actually, we had a much longer history of colonization. And to this moment, many Egyptians and Lebanese and Persians and Turks and Greek accuse the Arab of colonizing them and destroying their culture. And actually, it is true. There are so much bloody pages written by different nations. And it's not just the Western colonization. The notion of the West is one of the notions that annoys me a lot, because people tend to speak about the West and the rest. And as someone who lived in the States for some time, I worked in Canada, I lived in Britain, I lived in Germany, I can tell you there is no such thing as West. Poland is a European country, Romania, Czech. These countries have almost no significant contribution, and at least within psychology. If we talk the figures of psychology, which people keep referring to them as white old guys, we think about Freud. Freud was a student of civilization. He had so many books about different cultures and ideas. His book about monotheism, it's a masterpiece. And the guy was a student of the old professors. You spoke about Al-Kindi, Abyssina before that spoke about the same ideas, and Al-Razi. But all of them spoke about them as a continuation of the Greek philosophers. Now, I think many people, and I understand, it's really a good intention. If we could incorporate religion and psychology, that would be beautiful. The problem, it's impractical and it's very dangerous. When we speak about, I'll speak about the Islamic societies which I work on, and I know very well. You have people who believe in jinn, so they can go around and stab other people. And once you direct them to go to, and we've had it, we just had 2 girls who severed their mom's head because of the issue of jinn. And the case is still ongoing. And the problem is, in such a society where many physicians, many psychiatrists, many psychologists would like to accommodate and would say, fine, you can ask an imam, and they would go to the imam and they would never say, we want to kill our mom. But they would say, if someone is very evil, can we hurt him back? And the answer, yeah, you can defend yourself. The first day for me in the mental hospital in Kuwait, a guy came, they brought a woman with a nervous breakdown because her husband tried to run her over with the car. And that was an advice of the imam to discipline her. He was schizophrenic, he was delusional, and he thought that she's cheating on him. But of course, for an imam, he doesn't know what is delusion, doesn't understand schizophrenia. I understand why psychotherapy was very strict in separating religion from culture and from psychotherapy, because I'm still in the exact same moment right now. If you go to any mental hospital in Kuwait, it's not separated. Most psychiatrists use religion all the time. The results is nothing short of a disaster. Why? Because we cannot judge. You cannot judge. You don't have anything scientific. There is nothing falsifiable. If someone believes it's his duty to blow himself up, can you tell him that's no? Can you tell him no? Can a psychotherapy become an authority on religion? Any religion. When we speak about an Islamic idea, again, that does not exist. Muslims are hundreds of sects. There's 3 of us right now. I don't know how many sects we belong to. And within each sect, there is a sect. And within each sect, there is a sect. And each one of them has its own ideas and all conventions, and they are unfalsifiable. You cannot tell someone based on the religion this is and that, because someone else could tell him something else. And especially when we speak about psychotherapy, I do understand that some of the old scholars spoke some very smart models, but it wasn't their invention. They were continuing with the Greek and the Roman and the Persian and the Indians and the Chinese started. And the same thing, what we call West right now, I do not call it West. I do not consider it a West product, because it was built in all these. If you look at Jung, if you look at Freud, if you look at all the main figures, all of them are very intellectual people, and they understood the old cultures. And yes, they took from it. The beauty of what they did is they made it very specific. Yes, you're saying they repackage it. Fine. But this repackaging made it very specific, testable. I cannot test it. But once we go into the idea of combining religion with psychotherapy, then which religion, which explanation, what time of psychotherapy, and how are we going to do that? And that's fine maybe with someone with depression, but how about schizophrenia? How about personality disorder? How are we going to deal with a psychopath, with a borderline, with histrionic? How are we going to deal with obsessive compulsive behavior? These disorders are usually caused by much deep roots. And actually, it's when I see these studies that says Muslims are less likely to seek help, I cannot take them seriously, because I know very well once you invoke an identity, and that's my field, once you invoke an identity, people tend to present themselves in a better light, thinking that they have to say that mentally they're fine, they don't need any help. So I don't see psychotherapy as a secular or as a Western. I see it as a branch of science, and science by default need to be very neutral, need to be falsifiable, need to be based on an evidence, empirical. While when we speak about religion or philosophy or cultures, these are beliefs, these are tradition. You cannot test them, you cannot examine them, you cannot even reject them. And this is my issue with combining religion and psychotherapy. I do believe there have to be a strict separation. When you speak about psychotherapy, you speak about something scientific, could be examined, could be tested, could be rejected. I could say, you know what, CBT is bad and cannot work here. But I cannot say that about a religion or religion-based idea. Thank you.
Let's just come in a second. I've got, because you raised some really, really important points, but I'm just going to latch on the last point that you mentioned, the idea that psychotherapy is not falsifiable, and that is based on science. Because actually, I think there is a difference between psychology that is evidence-based and models that are protocol-led or manualized, and what is psychotherapy. So the real issue that we have, actually, one of the controversies is that psychotherapy is not a science. Psychotherapy is a combination between the art and some of the science. So if we think about kind of some of the psychotherapeutic ideas, the unconscious how do we even prove that the unconscious exists? If we think about Maslow hierarchy of needs, how do we even know that it exists or that is kind of right? And so on, you know, like kind of a lot of the psychotherapeutic models, they are ideas. And we have, for example, you know, some of the latest systemic ideas, you know, that suggest, well, actually, you know, conceptualizations don't have to be right or wrong. They just have to be helpful or unhelpful. So the way in which psychology, and particularly counseling psychology, stands is that we're interested in the phenomenological experience of the person. We're not here to police experiences or to ascertain whether something is true or not, but we're here to understand how the person views the situation and how we can adapt the tools that we have in the toolbox to kind of tailor so that we can work based on their experiences. And so that's kind of when I say, actually, the two things can coexist, because it's not so much about saying this is a jinn or this is not a jinn, but it's more about this is what you believe. What can we do, okay, based on your belief system to counteract the impact that the jinn has on you? And then we can bring in all the tools that we have. And the other issue that you have mentioned, which I absolutely agree with you, about kind of hallucinations, you know, so it sounds like the woman, you know, the two young women who've decapitated the mother, they were suffering from hallucinations, you know, and they kind of believed whatever, that you know, they had to act on that. We have the same in the West, except that people might not necessarily say the jinn told me, but they say the voices told me. So we've had a number of high-profile killings where people would just maybe get out of the tube, you know, one not far from where I live, you know, this young man got out of the tube and he killed another young man who was just happening to walk by with his wife. And he kind of, it was a horrendous stabbing because the voices had told him that he had to kill someone. So I'm not here to suggest that is either or, right? And certainly there is a space for medication, there is a space for psychiatry, you know, but I feel that we could work with explanatory models, because as you said, a lot of imams are very ignorant to the signs of mental illness. And so if services worked with imams in kind of training them to recognize the signs of mental illness, then we would catch people and we would avoid people saying, yes, you can run over your wife as a punishment because you believe that she's cheating, or things like that. So we've had that, for example, you know, in Iraq, you know, there have been kind of attempts to work with kind of local imams to just kind of train them into what the science of mental health is and what might be the domain of religion and what might be the domain of psychology and psychiatry. And that has had some positive results, you know. Now, nothing stops someone who, let's say, believe that, you know, a jinn tells them to kill someone, to perhaps use the Quran as a way to counteract the voice, the jinn, the voice of the jinn. And so, for example, I worked with a young woman recently who was Muslim, and she believed that her difficulties were caused by a jinn. And so we started using some of the externalization techniques of systemic therapy. How would the jinn look like? You know, how does it speak to you if you can't see it? You know, when is it angrier? When is it kind of more peaceful? You know, and then what we did, we used the Quran because the jinn was saying that she was completely powerless, and I can't remember if it was a he or a she, but the jinn was really powerful and he could make her do what they wanted. It could make her kill herself. And so what we did, we looked through the Quran, and we spent sessions, after sessions looking through the Quran to identify specific parts of the Quran that spoke to her, and that gave us some sense of empowerment that made her understand that actually she had power against the jinn, and she wasn't just, his mercy. Now, that piece of work was incredibly empowering for this young woman. It doesn't mean that there is no room for medications or for services, but it means that we work with their explanatory models. Do I believe that she had a jinn? Maybe not. Does it matter? No, it doesn't. If it helps her engage more, then I go along with it. It's not actually that I go along with it. I work with that, and I work very passionately with that. It's more about, I'll give you like a personal example. So sometimes if I know I'm kind of overworked and I can't sleep, because my brain keeps going, I go to sleep, and before I go to sleep, I put this kind of meditation of subliminal messages to relax and stuff like that. Does it work? I don't know if it works. Does it make me feel better? Yes, it does. So even if it has a kind of placebo effect for me, why not using that? And so that's kind of where I come from. If I want to engage the 50, 60-year-old woman from Najaf or Karbala or wherever, and I start talking about thoughts and, how do you feel? She's going to look at me like, what is that? But if I talk about the Quran, if I talk about the Hadith, if I show her that I'm ignorant and I want to learn from her or him or whatever it is, that's what kind of increases engagement. And I think that's the real use of psychology, but I agree with you. I totally agree with you, particularly in relation with Imam, and some of the lack of knowledge. And I think that's why we need to engage with mosques, because otherwise what tends to happen is that actually a lot of risky situation can happen, outside services view. I'm going to shut up because
Actually, I'm enjoying the talk so much. So, again, they're not just ignorant. There is a self-serving bias. There's biases. So when you ask an imam to adapt something else, he's not a psychologist. He would never understand psychology. You have to teach him from scratch. And it's not going to happen because you're telling him to give up his own business. And it's not going to work. That's one. Number two, if we speak about phenomenology, fine. Whether we start from Heidegger and Hassler up to this day, when you speak about it as a personal experience, how people make sense of the world, construct the world, and deal with it, that's something. And if there is a universal truth or not. So if someone says that my right is to kill you, is that okay? Can that acceptable because he thinks it's his right? It's not. No, there are some universal truth, and we have to accept that. Some people are a threat to themselves and to others. Some people are schizophrenic. If we go back to speak about the same notion, like, can we embrace some parts and reject the others? So, for example, is it okay to believe in jinn if it's not harmful, but it became harmful? Then no, it's not acceptable. And after you've worked with that person using the Bible or the Talmud or the Torah or any other book, what if someone else worked with him outside? And how about your authority? I mean, your authority stems from the fact that you're a scientist. You have a specific approach, you have specific power. But now you're talking as a religious person, not as a scientist. So which one are you? And again, if you don't accept one point and you said it's fine, then is it fine for the other points? Is it fine, for example, if they hurt other people, if they hurt themselves, if they work on their delusions? I think this is the problem. I understand many people would like to embrace and would like to accept what they think of cultural differences. I do believe in the end, psychotherapy is part of medicine and it has to be regulated. We come back to the ideas of the unconscious or the conscious. We don't use that in psychotherapy anymore. And I'm against using any idea that is not proven to be effective. And by proven to be effective, whether through questionnaires, whether through self-report, whether through cumulative data, then actually there is a scientific base for that. So the old CBT, and by the way, I know David Byrne very well, and I had a good relationship with him. And I know many of the things that he used to use, he's not using anymore. For a reason. They prove out to be ineffective. They're just ideas. They're nice on paper. So again, if we want to speak about psychotherapy, we would have to make sure that what we're doing is scientific as much as we can. And what is not scientific and we're using it, we have to have some evidence based for that. And if not, then I'm sorry, we're outside of the science altogether. And in that case, we can do anything. We can go philosophy, we can use music, we can use any religion, anything. But again, we cannot call ourselves scientists. And even the notion of art, when we speak about psychotherapy and we say there is an art into it, we don't speak about art as something undisciplined, because even in art, there are some foundations, there are rules, there are regulations, and they are used for certain things. You cannot, for example, abuse children and say this is an art. It doesn't work like that. There are some regulations, you have to stick with them. The notion of mixing art with science and psychotherapy, it means that you have plenty of tools that are proven to be useful, and you have some freedom of using them in different situations based on what you think. This is what I think, and I'm hoping more and more it's going to be more structure. Thank you.
That's a really good point. I'm actually completely the opposite. Sorry. I think, can I just say one last point?
Yes. So we have about 5 minutes left to the discussion. So maybe just final words from Dr. Angie and then Dr. Talal.
Yeah, okay. It's just, I love these conversations. So I think where we're coming from actually is moving away from the idea of power into the power is within the individuals. So science traditionally has the practitioner or the scientist as the one who's in charge, the one who has the knowledge. Psychology, clinical and counseling psychology over the last 20 years is moving away from that idea towards the idea that actually the power and the knowledge resides within the person, within the client. And so when you work with people, you don't work from a position of authority. You work from a position of humbleness, and you work from a position of you, the client being the expert, and you wanting to learn from them how your knowledge can help them to resolve whatever it is. So if I was to work, and when I have worked with kind of religious services, I don't ask them to adapt the way in which they work. I don't ask them to adapt the way in which they think. I open up dialogues to see where the points of contacts are. Because if I went to someone and I said, it's a bit like if I came to your house and I said, I don't like that sofa, you need to change it. Be like, whoa, hang on a second, you know. But if we had, you know, if we approach people from a position of wanting to learn, I approach people saying, I don't know anything about this. I don't know anything. You need to teach me. I am the pupil and you're the, you know, the teacher. These are the tools that I have, but they amount to nothing unless you give me your expertise. And so as psychologists, we're not just scientists, we are scientist practitioners. So we embrace the idea of art and psychotherapy being an art, because actually we don't have evidence-based for a lot of things, primarily because psychotherapy, it's a two-way endeavor where we co-construct meaning. I might kind of present with depression that looks like not sleeping, eating too much, crying all the time. And Joe Block might present with depression, which is never sleeping, not eating, arguing all the time. So the kind of science is the same. The experience is the same. What we construct, what we are making here now today is very difficult to be able to be replicated tomorrow, because maybe our mental state might be different, the context would be different. So I think our position as psychologists is that we're not just relying on science. What happens, which I think is the magical bit, is the relationship with the person, and that's what we use to kind of facilitate change.
We know this is a very intense topic, and we're really enjoying this wonderful discussion. But if Dr. Talal, you have any final remarks, and then Dr. Angie.
I'll be very quick. Again, as a psychologist, I would like to think of myself as a scientist. I would like to stick to the scientific method. I don't think it's a Western or created in the West. I think it's a human method that was created to solve human problems. The notion of power, which some psychologists, not all psychologists, would like to reject. They reject it on paper, but they practice it in reality, because when you get a schizophrenic, you don't tell him, oh, it's up to you. You say this is, and actually in forensic psychology, and which is a big part of my practice, it's me who has the power, and I'm in charge of saving the person from themselves and from the society based on the knowledge which I've got. And if I don't practice this power, I will be a criminal. This is how it goes. You cannot let people in the streets who pose danger to themselves and to others. Thank you.
Can I answer? We would go on forever, so I'll just pause it here. I think this deserves kind of follow-up discussions, either here or separately. But yeah, I mean, I understand what Dr. Talal is saying. I still think that we can work collaboratively with clients from a position of respect, even though we might at times have to take decisions that might be in contradiction with what the person is saying. And I've had instances where I've had to breach confidentiality. I've had to, calling other meetings, but you had the power. I try and do that. So this is less about power and is more about safeguarding, right? And the way in which I try and do that is by always working in collaboration with the client. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not possible. But there are situations, where you need to act. You need to act for the person and not the person.
Yes.
But
I think we can do that.
That's really wonderful, Dr. Angie. I think in the end, what we're all trying to do what's in the best interest of our patients. And
thank you so much, and we need a follow-up.
Yes, and we really enjoyed this discussion. We enjoyed hearing your thoughts, Dr. Angie, Dr. Talal, of course, and hopefully we would love maybe later on, maybe we'll follow up and see what we can do in future episodes.
Would be great. Hopefully I could speak with you later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's very
Thank you very much, and it has been a pleasure to kind of meet you all.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Ciao.